Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Samach. Today's daf is sponsored by Terry Karosh and Rabbi Chaim Herring in loving memory of Rose Lubin, Ruth Elisheva bat Nechama Rachel v'Chaim David on her second year at site. Great niece of our dear friends Eddie and Minda Snitkov. Tihi Zichra Baruch. Today's daf is sponsored by Naomi and Adam Fersger in honor of the birth of their granddaughter Ella Noga, daughter of Avital and Sefi Becker. Hodu LaHashem Kitov. Mazal Tov. Okay, we're going to get started. I'm going to do a quick review of yesterday's daf using the study guide. Okay, so we're going to share screen right now, and it's going to be very useful. Okay, so just get us into where we are and where we're going. We started yesterday about Mizbeach Shenifgam, and we're going to come back to this when we're done. We're sidetracked from that. Come back to other laws about Mizbeach Shenifgam, but the main law we saw, we're going to talk basically about Rav's opinion today, was any kodshim that were slaughtered when the Mizbeach is not was damaged, or not there at all, are disqualified. Okay, the Mizbeach has to be there and be intact and be all ready to go when you slaughter, even though obviously you don't need the Mizbeach for slaughtering, but if, let's say you slaughtered and then the Mizbeach got fixed, too bad. Okay, it's disqualified. And then we said, right, he thinks only from slaughtering. Rabbi Yochanan thought even earlier, but we're not going to get into that right now. The second difficulty we brought against Rav was that Rav himself said that if the Mizbeach is uprooted, you can do the ketoret in the place where the altar was. To which we answered, oh no, that's the ketoret. But we're going to distinguish between the ketoret and the blood. Just like Rabbi Yehuda distinguished between the ketoret and other things that he said could be burned on the floor of the Hazara, okay, which we'll get to in a second where he gets that from, but he didn't allow the bloods. Okay, we're going to come back to this, okay, but in order to explain, okay, we're going to do this whole long tangent that we got off on, starting from really the very bottom of Nun Tet Amud Aleph and continuing well into today's daf, was all to give us the background for how we, and for the statement of Rava about Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda agrees, admits that even though you could use the floor of the Hazara for burning parts of the sacrifice, you cannot use it for the blood. And therefore, we're going to say the same thing by Rav. Just because he says you could do the ketoret doesn't mean he would allow the korban to be done with the blood. That's basically the main thing. So now we said, what's this opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? And for that, we brought this pasuk that we had two different explanations of. Okay, even though it all starts with the pasuk, the real thing centers on, and maybe you'll see this today, this Ravua Gzeira Shava. Do we learn it from Yechezkel, or do we learn it from the Mizbeach HaPnimi? And that then kind of creates this whole big debate about what happened in the time of Shlomo, because it all depends on what size all these altars were. By the way, there's a gefet about this Mizbeach HaNechoshet of Moshe, and the fact, was it hidden, or was it, basically nignaz? So we're going to say put away, and that's Rabbi Yosi's position here. Anyway, that's a whole interesting shiur of Rabbi Yael Shimoni that's on our site now. So we started with this pasuk. Again, I'm just doing a good review because I think it's important to get back into the mode, because we're going to relate back to different parts of this 4-section debate between the two of them, Rabbi Yosi and Rabbi Yehuda. It starts with this pasuk. Bayomu kiddash hamelech toch hachatzir. So basically, Shlomo HaMelech, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Dvarim Kechtavan, he sanctified the floor of the Hazara, okay? Because what was the problem? The Mizbeach HaNechoshet Asher Lifnei Hashem was too small. Okay? This creates a bit of a problem. We didn't talk about this yesterday, but we're going to get to it today, which is what Mizbeach HaNechoshet was too small. What's the Mizbeach HaNechoshet? The Mizbeach HaNechoshet is actually the Mizbeach of Moshe. But the Mizbeach HaNechoshet mentioned here in the pasuk must be referring to the Mizbeach of Shlomo, which is very weird because the Mizbeach that Shlomo built was stone and not copper. Okay? So basically, the way we're going to understand this pasuk is, what he was saying is the Mizbeach of Shlomo was too small. We're going to have to get to why does he call it Mizbeach HaNechoshet then. Okay? It was too small for all the sacrifices, so Shlomo needed more space. So he sanctified the floor. You can use that space for sacrifices. And why was that? Because he had 120,000 sacrifices to bring in that day. Rabbi Yosi said, 120,000 sacrifices, no big deal. We got plenty of space for that, because look, before the temple was built, he was using the Mizbeach of Moshe, which only had a space of 1 by 1 in the middle that you could use for burning, because the other 2 cubits were walking around, and the other 2 cubits were for the corners. And that Mizbeach was 5 by 5 altogether. So that gives you a 1 by 1 space. 1,000 in a space of 1 by 1 would mean that on the new Mizbeach that Shlomo built, it was 20 by 20, would fit 400,000 a day. Plenty of space. So basically, he doesn't agree with that opinion. What does he say? He says the Mizbeach HaNechoshet, literally of Moshe, was too small. Basically, it paled in comparison to this big altar, and he put it out of use. Okay, and in other places it says he was nignaz, it was hidden, it was put away. Okay, and disqualified from use because it was just too small compared to the big one. Then we went back and forth with all these different things. So it says Chamesh Amot or Chamesh Amot Rochav. So what about Rabbi Yehuda? Why didn't he think that was an issue? Right? Why didn't he think, based on that there would be plenty of space? Like, what does he do with Rabbi Yosi's difficulty? The Mizbeach was really 10 by 10 cubits. Why was it 10 by 10 cubits? Because 5 is from the center point. 5 this way, 5 that way, 5 that way, 5 that way. It was really 10 by 10. And the pasuk that says Chamesh Amot is not to be understood literally. Even though he doesn't understand that literally, though, he does understand literally the Shalosh Amot, which is in the height. He took literally, whereas Rabbi Yosi didn't take that literally, if you remember, because then we went to, well, what does Rabbi Yosi do with the Gzera Shava? He learns the Gzera Shava to something else, that the height of the altar was 10, because it was double the length, just like in the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the inner one, it was 1 by 1, but 2 height, so the height was double the length. Also here, the height was double the length, and he gets to a height of 10, even though in the pasuk it says literally 3 amot, which is what Rabbi Yehuda understands. So again, let's just talk about the size. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the size was 3 amot high, 10 by 10 width and length. According to Rabbi Yosi, it was 10 in height, but 5 by 5 in width. Okay? Now, that led us to a whole debate about the height of the Chatzir, and that's where we ended yesterday, where basically Rabbi Yehuda says there's no way it was 10 high because the walls, the curtains around the courtyard were only 5, and there's no way if it was 5 and the Kohen's at a height of 10, everyone could see exactly what he was doing on top of the altar. To which Rabbi Yosi answered, what are you talking about? It was 5. It was really 15, and he quotes a different pasuk that says 15, and then what's the 5 then? The 5 is from the top of the altar, it was 5 cubits. Okay, so the curtains went 5 cubits higher than the height of the Mizbeach. That's a review of what we did yesterday. Okay, I hope it was worth your while that we went back and to that review, because now it's going to help you for the next few lines, because now they're going to do a bit of questions on that whole thing. Okay, and it's a bit of a strange, I thought it was a strange, atypical section of the Gemara, because it's not so organized. They're just kind of throwing questions on different parts of it. At least that's the way it looked like to me. Maybe there's some better organization that I didn't catch. But now we're going to start with Umat Tamud Lamar, second line of today. So we got that the Chamesh Amot is from the top of the altar. Okay? Now, Umat Tamud Lamar Shalosh Amot Kamato. Now, Rabbi Yosi, okay, I'm not going to share screen, but you can look back at that chart. It might help you. The Shalosh Amot Kamato, okay, according to Rabbi Yosi, wasn't literal. Remember, he learns Ravua. It's twice the height. It was 10 cubits. So why does it say 3 in the text? So what is, it's one thing to say, don't understand it literally, there's some other way to learn the height, but what it says 3 cubits. What are you going to do without those words? Misvat sovev ulamala. Remember, the sovev is that ledge, and the ledge was at a height of 6. And from there to the top of the altar, just be careful what we say, it's 10 amot, but from there to the top of the altar, by the way, I just want to make it clear, according to Rabbi Yosi, the height of Moshe's Mizbeach was the exact same height as the Mizbeach in the Beit HaMikdash. Now that Mizbeach had, if you remember, the first cubit on the bottom was the Amah. Then it goes up 5 more cubits to the height of 6 cubits, and then we get to the Sovev, which is that ledge that went around that people would climb up to do the bloods on the upper part of the altar. Then that went 3 cubits in height, because even though it's 10, and that only gets you to 9, but remember, the kranot, the horns of the altar, on the corners there, are 1 cubit in height, and that gets you to 10. 10 is from the very bottom to the very top, even though it doesn't mean for the flat surface at the top. The flat surface is at 9. So the 3 cubits, just like in the temple, it was the same in the time of Moshe, according to Rabbi Yosi, those 3 cubits got you from the Sovev to the top of the altar. Rabbi Yehuda, now we're going to sort of just point out different issues that come up about different things they said. So now they're just pointing out, even though we know this already, I'm not really sure why they're pointing this out. Ki gomer Gzera Shava, and as if you didn't take the Gzera Shava like Rabbi Yosi did, that the Gzera Shava was from the Mizbeach, the inner altar that was the height was twice the width, or twice the length. Ki gomer Gzera Shava biruch bahu de gamar. He didn't have the Gzera Shava to teach about the height. He had the Gzera Shava to teach about the width. Okay, the width and the length, that it was 10 by 10, because the Gzeira Shava taught you that 5 is from the middle. It's the radius. Ula Rabbi Yehuda. Another question now. Rabbi Yehuda, if it's 3 cubits in height, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, the curtains around the courtyard were at a height of 5 cubits. Now, what's the height of a person? Average person, we said 3 to 4 cubits, which means that actually you're going to see the Kohen. Hakam itchaze Kohen, because at 3 cubits of height, he's going to go up to 6 or 7, and the walls of the courtyard are 5. So people are going to see the Kohen. I thought we wanted tzniut here, that nobody sees what he's doing. Well, think about it. They might see him when he stands up, but when he's doing the work, he's doing it on the mizbeach, which is only 3 in height. No, you can't see from 5 amot curtains. You can't see through what's going on the altar. That's what bothers us. We don't mind they see which Kohen is working in the temple. That's not the issue. It's not that kind of tzniut that they don't want the Kohen to be seen. We don't want everyone watching the avoda that he's doing. Which is, by the way, an interesting question in general, right? Is it because we don't want the people seeing what's going on, or maybe we don't want the Kohen being self-conscious, that people are looking at him? You want him to be able to focus. I would think that would be a better explanation, right? That if you know people are watching you, you get more nervous, and then things can happen, as we know, a machshava, something, it's just distraction. But it does seem like we also don't want the people looking at him. But again, why not? That's a whole question. Okay, now, back to another question about this. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yehuda, hainu dichtiv kidash. Now, why did Shlomo HaMelech sanctify the floor of the courtyard? So according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's very obvious. He sanctified so that people could burn things on it because there wasn't enough room on the altar. Elul Rabbi Yosi, my kidash, lami b'mizbeach. Okay, according to him, he sanctified the floor so that he could put a new altar there. Remember, the altar was going to take up a much bigger space. So we needed to sanctify the courtyard in order to accept the mizbeach in the courtyard. Bishlam ala Rabbi Yosi, hainu dichtiv katon. Now it says, here comes the question about the Mizbach HaNechoshet. So the Mizbach HaNechoshet, which is basically the one that Moshe built, was too small. And that's why he put it out of use. Ela Rabbi Yehuda, my katon. What is small? How is the Mizbach HaNechoshet being small have anything to do with this? It's the Mizbach of Shlomo that was too small, not the Mizbach HaNechoshet. The Mizbach that Shlomo built was stone. Makes no sense. Hachi Kamar. This is what he meant to say. Mizbach avanim sha'asa Shlomo tachat Mizbach HaNechoshet katonaya. The Mizbach that Shlomo built to replace the Mizbach HaNechoshet was too small. So when it says the Mizbach HaNechoshet was too small, what he means is the replacement for the Mizbach HaNechoshet was too small. Okay? So now they get to the root of the machloket, and this is what I mentioned before. What's really at the root of the machloket? What's really at the root of the machloket, and what affects everything really, if you say what's really at the center here, it's where you do the Gzeira Shava. You learn the Gzeira Shava because from there everything springs forth. Because if you say it was 5 by 5 or you say it was 10 by 10, that's going to affect the whole thing about was the Mizbeach of Shlomo big enough or not. Okay, so that's the root of the machloket. Do we compare it for the height and say the height was 2 and that's learned from the Mizbeach HaPnimi? Or do we compare it for the width and we get to, just like in Yechezkel, 12 wasn't really 12 by 12, it was 24 by 24 because it was measuring it from the center. Also here we're measuring it from the center. 5 by 5 didn't really mean 5 by 5, but 10 by 10. So what's the difference? What's the machloket really? What's at the root? Mar savar danim chutz michutz ve'in danim chutz mipnim. He says, I'm not going to learn about the Mizbeach HaChitzoni that was outside, right, in the courtyard, from the Mizbeach that was in the inner sanctuary. Those are two very different things. I'm not going to learn that from that. We've seen this before. You don't want to learn things that go on inside from things that go on outside, from things that are learned inside, or the reverse. They're two very different spaces. So he preferred to learn from Yechezkel, which was describing the Mizbeach that's outside. So outside Mizbeach from outside Mizbeach rather than from the inner Mizbeach. Umar Savar, Danin Klimi Kli, Ve'en Danin Klimi Binyan. So the second opinion is, no, we want to learn the two Mizbachot in the time of Moshe, the inner and the outer, were both similar in that they were called vessels. What makes something a vessel? It's movable, it's portable. Those were portable, they were small. The Mizbeach that Yechezkel is talking about, this 24 by 24, was in the ground. And it was not considered a vessel because it wasn't moved. It was kind of attached to the ground there, and it was solid, and it was not moving at all. So I'm not going to learn something that's not a vessel from something that's not a vessel. I'm going to learn a vessel from a vessel, both the inner and the outer altar in the time of Moshe. Okay. That is the whole machloket Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yosi, and we really kind of took it apart and understood. Now we can fully understand how everybody understands each of those psukim, even though, like I mentioned yesterday and like I mentioned again today, it's very interesting that each one takes some parts very literally and other parts not literally at all, right? And we end up with this kind of ping pong between them. And particularly, I think it's interesting that in that one pasuk where it says 5 by 5 in length and width and 3 in height, one takes 5 by 5 literally, one takes 3 literally, and neither does both. Anyway, that's all to say that according to Rabbi Yehuda, what's important here for our purposes, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they sanctify the floor of the Azara in order to sacrifices on it, right? To burn parts on the altar. But what he didn't agree about, and there comes in Rava, which we mentioned yesterday, now we're going to see where Rava says it in the context of this, Modet, I'm a Rava, Modet, Rabbi Yehuda b'damim, but he admits that even though the floor was sanctified for bringing sacrifices, meaning, that means burning parts of the animal on the floor. Like make a fire, burn the parts there. But not for pouring the blood on the altar. You can't pour the blood on the floor and say, oh, the floor is sanctified, I'm putting the blood here, and now we're going to get atonement for this sacrifice. That he didn't agree with. Now Rava is going to bring a proof, which in the end we're actually going to reject his proof. Okay, but he tries to bring a proof. How does he know that Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say the floor is sanctified for the purposes of accepting the blood? And we're going to see a sugya that we learned already. Ditanya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. For the Korban Pesach, remember we talked about it was very busy, there was a lot of things going on, there was concern that the blood was going to spill. So what did Rabbi Yehuda suggest? He said this is what they would do. Kos echad haya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Kos, and notice it's Rabbi Yehuda. Kos echad haya memalei midam hatarchovet. They would take a cup, scoop up blood from the floor. If you remember, we learned even more. They would they would plug up the floor, right? There was a drain there that would send all the bloods and all the mess to Nachal Kidron. And basically they would stop it up, keep the bloods on the floor, right? And what was the reason according to Rabbi Yehuda? Because they would pick up a cup, right? A cup full of blood that was mixed up with all the bloods of the sacrifices and pour it on the altar. For what reason? In case one of the bloods from someone's Korban Pesach had spilled on the floor, this will resolve it. Now, why does this mean that the floor wasn't good enough for accepting the blood? Because obviously, he thought the whole floor of the temple was sanctified for the purposes of accepting the blood. Well, then the blood had accomplished what it needed. The blood was on the floor. If the floor is accepting blood, all the blood that's spilled on the floor should be totally fine. In other words, you wouldn't need to pick up and redo it if it fell on the floor. Right? If you can burn it on the floor, it can go on the floor. So there's your proof that Rabbi Yehuda must have thought that the blood is not, right, modeh yabedamim, that the damim doesn't work. You can't put the blood on the floor. Well, the Gemara is going to have two questions with this. Dilma mishum dekasaval shvicha bikoch adam beina. Wait a minute. The fact that blood spills on the floor by accident is, okay, we've talked all about intention in the temple. That can't work. Even if you say, let's say there wasn't enough room and people were busy on the altar and the Kohen wants to pour the blood on the floor instead of on the altar. Maybe there's just no room. Everyone's surrounding the altar, right? Because let's say if you're on the sides, everyone's surrounding the altar. There's no way to get there. So you just pour it on the floor. That maybe Rabbi Yehuda would agree. But still, this Pesach wouldn't work. In other words, if potentially what they're saying is you can't prove it from there, because you could theoretically say if someone pours it on the floor intentionally, it'll work. But if it's spilled, right, that's not the way. Accidentally spilling blood on the floor is certainly not going to fulfill your mitzvah. So the Gemara says, no, I'm still going to prove it. Why? Let's say you need to do it intentionally. So there's an easier solution, as we always want to try to find the easiest solution possible. So the Kohen picks up the cup. Let's say whatever spilled on the floor is definitely not going to work. But if Rabbi Yehuda thought you could actually pour it on the floor, so let's do like this. Scoop up the cup. Now what did it say? Takes it and shofcho al gabei mizbeach. He throws it on the altar. Theoretically, he could throw it right back on the floor. Pick it up, throw it on the floor, and be yotze. So there's your proof that Rabbi Yehuda must admit that you can't do that, because he doesn't say you can do that. He says you have to put it on the altar. But the Gemara rejects this, because the Gemara says, no. Dilma mishum debi'ina mitzvah muvchal. It could be just he wanted it to be done in an ideal way. Okay, let's take two choices. If you could pour it on the floor or pour it on the altar, obviously it's better to pour on the altar. So they just wanted the mitzvah to be done better, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda suggested that. It doesn't mean that he didn't think it couldn't be done on the floor. So we don't have perfect proof that Rabbi Yehuda definitely held this way, but Rava definitely claims that Rabbi Yehuda held this way, that even though the floor was sanctified, it wasn't sanctified for blood. And that was all because we had this difficulty with Rav, that Rav said, oh, you could use, even the ketoret could be brought even when there's no altar. And they said, yeah, that's ketoret, not blood. Okay, and that's why we get back to the mizbech shenifgam, according to, right, if you slaughter the animal while the mizbech is no good, it's invalid, right? The rest of the sacrifice is invalid. You can't sprinkle the blood because there's no mizbech. Okay, and then no difficulty with the ketoret. When there's no mizbech, you can actually do the ketoret on the floor, because just like Rabbi Yehuda distinguished between the blood and other things, also you could say Rav distinguishes between the blood and the incense. Now we're going to go back to the mizbech shenifgam and other things that can't be done when the mizbech is damaged. Amar Rabbi Elazar, mizbech shenifgam em ochlim begino she'arei mincha. You can't eat the remainder of the mincha offerings. Okay, the Kohanim would eat that. It's Kodesh Kodeshim. Okay, we're going to see now a pasuk and where we get it from. So what it means here is, let's say, I brought a sacrifice, a mincha offering. The Kohen brings it. He does the kmitza. He burns it on the altar. And then he goes to eat the remainder of the meal offering, which he's allowed to do right now. But if the mizbech then becomes, after he does whatever he needs to do on the altar, the burning of the kmitza, he goes to eat the shayrei mincha. But at this point, in between that and that, the mizbech gets destroyed, okay? Damaged something. It's no good. So you can't eat the shayrei mincha. Where do we get it from? Well, in the Miluim, those days we keep going back to them, all sorts of things happen. The May Miluim, and we have all sorts of details discussed. So this is right after Nadav and Avihu die. It says in Vayikra chapter 10, Vayidaber Moshe al Aaron ve'el Elazar ve'el Itamar banav notarim. Okay, so he says, Moshe says to Aaron and his two sons that are left, take the remainder of the mincha offering that's for you to eat. Eat it matzot, because it was matzah. The minchas were all matzot. Eitzel hamizbech. Eat it next to the altar. Ki kodesh kodashim hi. We're now going to darshan these last 6 words. Near the altar, because it's high level sanctity item. Okay, the shayrei mincha or kodesh kodashim. That's why they can only eat by kohanim. So he says here, they didn't eat it right next to the altar. That's not where they ate it, or they didn't have to eat it right next to the altar. It can't be understood literally. Go sit next to the altar and eat it there. What does it mean, etzel mizbech? It means eat it while the mizbech is in good shape. Okay, if the mizbech is damaged, you can't eat it. That's what they learned here. Then they said, okay, so eshkachan shayrei mincha. So that teaches you about the remainders of the mincha. What about kodesh kodeshim minalim? What about all kodesh kodeshim? Well, that's very obvious from the end of that pasuk. Talmud Lomal, kodesh kodeshim. It says, because it's kodesh kodeshim. So there you see, just like this had to be next to the altar, because it's kodesh kodeshim, meaning next to the altar, not literally next to it, but when the altar is not damaged, and it's completely whole. So, likewise, all kodesh kodeshim like that. Okay, very easy. Now we're going to get into something that's a little less easy, which is kodshim kalim minani. Where do we get that also kodshim kalim? Now, kodshim kalim, it's very different. Kodshim you eat in the azara. That's where the mizbech is. So it makes sense, to a certain extent anyway, that if the mizbech is not completely whole and there's some problem, damage, well, you can't eat the kodshim, right? You're in the space where the altar is. There's something wrong there. Kodshim kalim can be eaten anywhere in Jerusalem. So what's the connection between the mizbech and the kodshim kalim, right? Like, theoretically, they shouldn't really be a connection. So now they want to know kodshim kalim minai. Now, what would be the case? The case would be, okay, obviously, if the mizbech is pagum, you can't slaughter your animal and do any of that stuff. We just learned that. But let's say the mizbech was totally fine. You slaughtered, you did the blood, you finished all those parts, and now you want to eat the meat. And all you have to do is eat it in Jerusalem, and you have, let's say, most kodshim kalim, you have 2 days and a night. So let's say it's the next day, and in between, or it could be the next minute, it doesn't matter. But in between, the mizbech is damaged. Are you allowed to eat kodshim kalim? So how do we know, really what they're asking is, how do we know that even kodshim kalim you can't eat? So for this, We're going to get off on a long answer of Abaye. Now remember, it's Abaye. I always go back to that bus driver joke, tell the bus driver joke. And then you can't remember, right, the whole thing. They say, Bob is the bus driver, and then they go into like 3 people got on, 5 people got off. You get so distracted that by the end you can't remember who the bus driver was. So remember, it was Abaye who said this because, right, and that's the whole joke. You're supposed to know who the bus driver is. So you weren't paying attention. So remember, because we're going to get back, and Rabbi Yirmiyah is going to attack Abaye for what he said. Okay. So, I'm Rabbi. Anti midrasha de Rabbi Yosi, Ditanya. Okay, I'm going to learn this from a drasha of Rabbi Yosi. It's going to take us a while till we get to where we get from this drasha, what we're looking for, which is kochim kalim, that after the blood was sprinkled and everything was done properly, and then the mizbeach becomes just damaged, you cannot eat kochim kalim even in Jerusalem, right? You're not allowed to eat them at all. So, it's just like the shayrim and kochim. Ditanya, Rabbi Yosi Omer Shlosha Dvarim Mishum Shlosha Zkenim. Turning now to Amabet. So Rabbi Yosi said, I learned 3 things from 3 elders, and this is, okay, V'zeh echad mehem, and this is one of them, Abaye is telling us, okay? So here we go. Rabbi Yishmael Omer. We're not getting the other 2, we're only getting 1. Yachol ya'aleh adam ma'aser sheni liYerushalayim v'yochlenu b'zman hazeh. Ma'aser sheni. Let's talk about Ma'aser sheni. It's the second tithe. You do it in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle. You bring a tenth of your produce to Jerusalem, or to redeem it on a coin, and you bring the coin to Jerusalem. Nowadays, you have to still separate the Ma'aser Sheni. But what you're supposed to do is bring the fruits to Jerusalem and eat them in Jerusalem, or bring the money and buy produce or food, or you could buy animals and sacrifice them, eat them. You could do sacrifice, you could do not sacrifice, you could just slaughter them. Eat them in Jerusalem. Now, you might have thought that you could take, I think you can buy sacrifice with, actually there's questions about what you could buy with Ma'aser Sheni money, but anyway, you could definitely buy animals. I think you can even buy animals for sacrifices. But either which way, nowadays, we don't do that. What do? We take Ma'aser Sheni when it's those years, and we redeem it, because in the other 2 years it's Ma'aser Ani. You bring a tenth to the poor people instead of to Jerusalem for yourself. You take the money, you redeem your fruits on money, and then you have to destroy the money. Okay, you have to throw it in, people throw it in the Dead Sea or something. You have to just destroy it, because nothing you could do with it, because you can't eat it in Jerusalem b'zman hazeh. What Rabbi Yosi, now is quoting Rabbi Yishmael, is saying is, you might have thought maybe you could eat it in Jerusalem even when there's no temple. Like, theoretically, what's the connection between the temple and eating something within Jerusalem, right? Ma'aser Sheni has nothing to do with the temple. So he's going to start by a logical inference, which in the end he's going to reject, and then go for a hekesh. But vidinhu, either which way, he's going to learn it from the firstborn. Remember, the firstborn is kachim kalim, so that's the first indicator we're going to somewhat get close to, what we're looking for here. Vidinhu, bechor ta'un hava makom, u'ma'aser ta'un hava makom. So now we're going to first say how are they similar, that we could use one as paradigm to build a binyan ad for the other. Bechor needs Jerusalem. You have to eat it in Jerusalem. And Ma'aser Sheni needs eating in Jerusalem. They have a specific location where they have to be eaten, happens to be the same location. Okay, they're limited to Jerusalem. Ma bechor eno ele b'fnei habayit. And just like bechor, you can only eat when the temple is around. Okay, why? Because bechor, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to bring your firstborn animal to the Kohen. The Kohen's supposed to sacrifice it. You can't sacrifice, so you can't have bechor. What are you supposed to do nowadays, by the way? You still have to designate the firstborn animal. You give it to the Kohen, and the Kohen has to wait till it gets a blemish. Okay, we'll see an interesting mission about this animal that was so old, and they were like waiting for it to get a blemish so they could just slaughter it and eat it. Anyway, that's from Masechet Bechorot. So, ma bechor eno ela b'fnei habayit, af ma'aser eno ela b'fnei habayit. So just like ma'aser, you can only do when there's a temple. Also bechor, also ma'aser. Now, so at this point, we kind of think that they're talking about bechor that's born now when there's no temple. But soon we're going to see that's not exactly the case. He might be talking about a different kind of case of bechor, but anyway, we'll get back there. It's unclear whether at this point already they're thinking that or later, but we'll get to it in a bit. They say, how could you even make that comparison? I'm sure you're thinking about it, right? The bechor needs blood and the parts of the stuff burnt on the altar. It has all sorts of things that require temple. So that makes sense that you can't do it when there's no temple. But Ma'aser Sheni has nothing to do with the temple at all. Well, bikurim yochichu. Bikurim will prove it because they don't need blood and they don't need parts burned, right? They're fruits. So there is no blood. There are no fatty parts that are burned. And yet, right, Bikurim also need, only when there's a temple can you bring the Bikurim and eat them in the temple. So they said, no, because Mala Bikurim shken to unim hanacha. Well, now we're going to say, okay, the Bikurim need to be placed next to the altar. And the Bechor needs to have the blood and the Imurim put on the altar. So they each have their own unique chumrah, and that's why you can't learn from both of them, okay? Or from each of them, I should say. Okay, we'll get back to why can't you learn from both of them. The Gemara doesn't do that at this stage, okay? Or the Braita. Rabbi Yishmael then says that falls flat, and therefore, Talmud Lomar, we can't learn it from a binyan av, we'll learn it from a hekesh. Ve'evetem shama olotechem, okay, you have to read the rest of the pasuk, right? Bring to there your olot in Zevachim, obviously they're talking about the temple. Et masrotechem, okay, note maaser is in there. Et shumat yedchem v'nidrechem v'nidvotechem ubechorot bekorchem v'tzonechem. And the firstborn. So what's written there? Maaser and bechor. So we make a hekesh. What's true for bechor is true for maaser. Bechor can only be when there's a temple. Also maaser you can only eat in Jerusalem when there's a temple. Makish maaser the bechor. That's what we're going to read right now. Ma bechor eno ela b'fnei habayit. Av maaser eno ela b'fnei habayit. Period. That's his drasha. Okay. Now we're going to have some questions on this drasha. So I kind of made reference to this before. You have Bechor and you have Bikurim. Now each of them has their own unique chumrah, but theoretically you could say we could learn from the least common denominator between them. And then maybe we could learn from there to Maaser. But obviously the least common denominator there is not the same as Maaser, and that's what they're going to say now. Mishum de'ikal mifrach, because you can knock it out and say Malat tzad hashaveh ben sheyesh ben tzad mizbeach. They both need the altar for some reason. One needs it for blood and burning the fatty parts on the altar, and the other one needs it for placing the Bikurim next to the altar. So you definitely can't learn from both of them, from a Bameh Hatzad, from a least common denominator. But now comes the question, and I'll just point out, without going into details, but you might have taken a quick peek at tomorrow's daf. Amud Aleph of tomorrow's daf is 3 lines. Always fun when you're learning daf yomi. It's because there's a Tosfot that starts at the top of this daf and goes all the way down to the next daf, and it's an incredibly long Tosfot, and it's all about this question, and Tosfot differs from Rashi on a bunch of points. Anyway, I'm going to leave that part aside, but I will say that we're going to go with Rashi's interpretation. Okay, so my kasava. So now they want to understand, what was he thinking here now? In what point? So Rashi says, Hai tana de pshitale. Bechor tvei mimaser. The word tvei is missing there. It's in the notes. Anyway, what's the question? This Tana, meaning Rabbi Yishmael, it was obvious to him that Bechor needed the bayit. And it wasn't obvious to him that Maser Sheni. He had to learn that, right? It wasn't obvious. It wasn't intuitive. So they want to know why it was intuitive. And now you're going to see what the question is. So they're going to say, it's a question that builds. Ika savar. Now we're going to bring up this debate about kedusha rishona kitsha l'shata and kitsha l'atid lavo or lo kitsha l'atid lavo. Is the sanctity of the temple still there when there's no temple? Okay, when we had the area be sanctified in the beginning, built the temple, did it stay? Do we view it as if God's presence is still there or not? Okay, there's a big debate about this. It has all sorts of ramifications in all different sugyot. So ika saval. Okay, you can even see. Okay, this is a good example of a sugya that comes up in a lot of places. If you look in the Masoret Hashas, which tells you where you can find this. So mine it says Chagiga Daf Gimel Amud Bet, and then it says V'shin Nun. That means V'sham Nisman, and there it has the whole long list. They don't want to bother putting all the work in to give the whole long list of all those sugyot. In one place they do it, and then every time they say, "Oh, look there." So kedusha rishona kitsha l'shata v'kitsha l'atid lavo. Let's say you say the kedusha is still there. So then you would say, afilu b'chor nami. Then forget about, Maser Sheni, you should still be able to eat in Jerusalem. You should still be able to bring b'chor in Jerusalem, because if you say the sanctity is still there, that means basically something kind of radical sounding, that you could build an altar now and offer sacrifices if you wanted in the place where it used to be. So you could theoretically go there if it still has sanctity, so theoretically you could do b'chor nowadays. And then it should be the same. In other words, we're trying to figure out, why was it obvious that b'chor definitely not, and the question is, what about Maser Sheni? if you say there's no sanctity going forward once the temple is destroyed, then the question should be about Bechor also. Maybe Bechor. Now, what's the question here? So Rashi explains the question is, it's not a question. If you can't bring sacrifices today, then of course you can't bring Bechor. Okay? That's not a question. But what he's saying is the question must be, what if, when the temple was still there, you did the sacrifice, you brought the blood, you burnt the parts on the altar, and then the temple was destroyed, just like the case we had earlier. Now you're going to finally see the connection. And Rashi says that the question in Maaser, in other words, we want to find a parallel case between Maaser Sheni and Bechor. Now, it won't be parallel if you can't bring sacrifices, then obviously you can't do Bechor when there's no temple. And then what's the connection to Maaser Sheni? So they want to find a case where they're very similar. How would they be similar? Maaser Sheni doesn't need anything with the temple. So we want to find a case of Bechor that doesn't need the temple either. What would that be? That would be a Bechor that you did everything in the temple, and then the temple got destroyed before you ate the meat. And now we say, well, since there's no more Kedusha anymore, maybe you could eat the meat anyway or not. And then Bechor would be the same question as Maaser Sheni, and then it really makes no sense. Why, again, what doesn't make sense? Why was it so intuitive to Rabbi Yishmael that obviously Bechor you can't eat in Jerusalem once the temple's destroyed, even if you did everything before? So now we're going to have to figure out. Amar Ravina, La'olam Kasava Lo Kitcha. It really is the next. Oh, the truth is, maybe I jumped the gun. Let me just think for a second. At this stage, I think what they're saying is, now that I think about it, one second. No, Rashi already says it there. Okay. So, yeah, I didn't jump the gun. Rashi already said it there, that it's this unique case of Bechor. So now that comes Ravina and he answers. And Ravina says, Olam Kasava Lo Kitcha. It really is Lo Kitcha. And what's it talking about? And here the Gemara says explicitly what Rashi said a minute ago, which is Bebechor shenis rak damo kodem chorban habayit, v'charav habayit v'adayim b'saro kayam. So it is this case, what Rashi said, which is, it's Bechor that the blood was sprinkled before the chorban. Now the bayit was destroyed. Okay, you don't have to have the imurim, because remember, that's not ma'akev. I did mention it before, but could be they were done, it could be they weren't done, it doesn't really matter. But the blood was done on the altar. And now the temple is destroyed, and we have the meat, and we want to know, can you eat the meat? And a minute ago we said, but that's not so intuitive. Why is that any different than Maaser? What Ravina is going to explain is, why is it different than Maaser? Because itakish b'saro l'damo. By Bechor, remember the pasuk? What does the pasuk say? Okay, Rashi helps us if you don't remember the pasuk. Et damam tizroch ve'chabam taktir. Remember, we have that whole thing. Why does it say plural? And maybe it's to include Maaser Sheni and Maaser Behema, animal tithes, and Pesach. But anyway, it says bisaram and damam, their blood and their flesh. So what do we say here? We have what we call a hekesh, blood and meat. They're both the same. So madamo b'mizbech, af bisaro b'mizbech. And that's why it was obvious to Rabbi Yishmael, because of this hekesh. Said if the dam needs the altar, the basar needs the altar. This is finally why we were here in the first place. Remember what we were looking for? How do you know that the meat of Kachim Kalim, now Bechor is Kachim Kalim, right? And we're going to assume, okay, Abai is making a jump here, but that if it's true for Bechor, it's going to be true for everything, that all Kachim Kalim, the basar and the dam are hukash zelazeh, which means if the blood was done properly and you wanted to eat the meat, but then the mizbeach got damaged or the temple was destroyed, then you can no longer eat the meat. Okay? And that's what we were looking for, that the meat of Kachim Kalim can't be eaten when the mizbeach is damaged. So that's our point. But we're still in the middle of a sentence here, because we're trying to explain Rabbi Yishmael. And explaining Rabbi Yishmael, we get to the conclusion that Rabbi Yishmael started off with this assumption that Bechor, it's obvious because of that hekesh. And because he was talking about particularly this situation where the blood was already done, then the temple got destroyed, and then it proves our point. And then that was obvious to him, but it wasn't so obvious about Maaser Sheni, because that's not the same thing. But then he had this hekesh to learn from Maaser to Bechor. Okay, so that's what we were looking for. This is all to prove, right? Abaye took this to prove How do we know the Kodshim Kalim, right? Or what's the halacha by them? Or maybe how do we prove that Kodshim Kalim also can't be eaten if the Mizbeach is destroyed? So again, the Mizbeach gets destroyed after you finished everything about the Korban. Still, you can't eat it, and that's learned out from Bechor here. But we're going to have some questions. First question on this drasha of Rabbi Yishmael. There's an inherent problem in this drasha. Because according to the way we just explained it. Because how do we explain it? Right? This was Abai's whole point. He wanted to explain it to get to our point. That this must be that unique case where everything else was done and now the Mizbeach is no longer, and can you still eat it? And no, you can't. But to say that, you need to do a hekesh from the dam to the basal, right? Just like the blood, you also need, the Mizbeach has to be there also for the meat. And then from there, we did a hekesh. Once we learn it by Bechor, we're going to learn from a hekesh from there to Maaser. What's the obvious problem? You can't learn hekesh to hekesh in the world of Kodshim. So what's the obvious answer? Maaser dagan chulinu. Wait, Maaser sheni isn't hekesh, it's chulin, right? It's certainly, even if you say it has sanctity to it, which there's, right, it does have a certain level of sanctity and it has to be in Jerusalem, but it's not Kodshim, it's not sacrificial. So that whole law is only, that whole principle is only for sacrifices. Well, depends which way you hold about lamed or milamed, remember? So, hani chalaman damar batar lamed aslinan. If it's all about what you're learning to has to be chulin, well, that's good. We're learning to maaser, hekesh on hekesh works. But ela laman damar batar lamed aslinan. But the one who says this principle is true specifically for the one you're learning it from, you're learning it from the blood and the meat of a sacrifice. And then you can't do it. Ma'i kalamemer. How can you explain it? Well, he would explain it as damu basar chad miltihi. The hekesh, a basar de dam, is not really a hekesh. Because why? The blood and the meat is all one. So when it says the bloods and the meat, it's all just one thing. It's not like a hekesh. Oh, this is like that. They obviously are a package deal. It's a bit of a, right, it's just saying, okay, we're not using the technical hekesh thing here, but it's just more the one big topic. Okay. But now we get to a bigger question. Because Abani used this as his proof for the fact that if the Mizbeach and the Ifkan, Kodshim Kalim can't be eaten. Kisalik Ravin, when Ravin went to Eretz Yisrael, Amar Lashmate Kamedu Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Ravin was one of these Nechute, which means Yordim. Okay, they were one of the people that would go back and forth from Israel to Babel, bringing the Torah of one to the other. Now, usually he's quoted in the Gemara as bringing something to Babylonia, because we're in the Babylonian Talmud. In this case, it's actually quoted bringing something to Rabbi Yirmiyah, who actually grew up as a Babylonian but moved to Israel, which is interesting in light of this story. And this comes up, another thing that comes up a lot of times in Shas. According to the Masorah Shas, this phrase comes up 5 times. I didn't check each time, but it's often in the words of Rabbi, in the mouth of Rabbi Yirmiyah, from what I remember. So when Ravin went to Eretz Yisrael, Amar Lashmati says this before Rabbi Yirmiyah. And what did Rabbi Yirmiyah say? Amar Bavlai Tipshai, those stupid Babylonians. Okay, and he starts ranking on the Babylonians. He doesn't like the Babylonians. He says, because you live in a dark land. You say dark limudim, meaning like when you're in the dark, right? It's like saying you're in the dark, you don't understand anything. Okay, so you're in the dark, you don't understand anything, and I'm going to explain to you. Like he says, Lo shmiyalu, did you not learn? Hadetanya, it says in a Braita, Bishat siluk masaot. What's siluk masaot? When they were traveling in the desert and they would undo the Mishkan, which would mean the Mizbeach would be uprooted and it would be in its place. So, Kodshim nifsalim. Okay, it says that sanctified items are disqualified. Okay, that actually works. But Zavinu mitzara'im shtachim chutz l'mechitza. But there is still a separation. Okay, the Machaneh Shechina doesn't exist because the Mizbeach is moved. But the way they would move within their camps, the way they were. So there was still Machaneh Yisrael and Machaneh Leviyah as they were moving. And the Zavim and the Mitzora'im are, right? The Mitzora'im can't go into any camp and the Zavim can't go into the Machaneh Leviyah. Okay, so that, fine, that's a side point. V'tanya idach. There's another Braita that says, B'shnei mekomot kodashim ne'achalim. It says in 2 places. Now what they seem to understand 2 places means when they were camped and when they moved. Okay, as opposed to the previous one that said, while they were moving, you can't eat kodshim. Now he says you can eat kodshim both when they were moving and when they were stationary, when they were camped. So, how do you resolve the difficulty between these 2 Braita? Rabbi Yirmiyah says, "My lab habakochim kalim." The distinction is obvious. the ones that can't be eaten must be kosher kachim. The ones that can be eaten are kachim kalim, in which case, Abai, you're totally, completely wrong. You can eat kachim kalim even when the mizbeach is not in its place. So we're going to see, I don't want to go into tomorrow's daf, because if I continue this line, we'll probably almost finish on with Aleph tomorrow. So we'll leave Ravina's answer for tomorrow. We're going to see some possible resolutions to how to resolve this contradiction that Rabbi Yirmiyah kind of attacks Abaye with, saying, you stupid Babylonians, by saying you don't understand anything, but yet we're going to have a resolution to it. So what did we do today? We went back to this line of Rebbe, who said that Rabbi Yehuda agreed that blood can't be poured on the floor of the Azara when there's no mizbeach, presumably, right? The blood can't be or even if there is a mizbeach in place. But when he said, even though the floor of the Azara was sanctified, which we went on a whole long tangent to explain in what context he said it and what kind of caused him to say that, because of the size of the altar, it wasn't big enough, and how can it not be big enough because mizbeach and Moshe was actually a lot bigger than we thought, and all of that. So once we had that, we explained, and that's what Rav must be saying here, and why he distinguishes between the Ketoret and the blood, that the blood needs the altar where the Ketoret doesn't, because he has that same distinction. Then Rabbi Elazar brought up about Mizbeach Shadifgam, you can't have the Shayrei Mincha. Then they said, what about Kodesh Kodeshim? Well, Shayrei Mincha says it's Kodesh Kodeshim, so we got that, and the Shayrei Mincha we learned from Eitzel Mizbeach. And then we asked this question about Kodesh Kalim, and for that we had Abaye's answer, and now we have Rabbi Yirmiyah's answer, which is you definitely can eat Kodesh Kalim, even though Abaye said you can't, and he proved it in this whole long manner from this drasha of Rabbi Yishmael and how he understood the drasha of Rabbi Yishmael. It was all his explanation of the drasha, that it must be, why was it obvious to him? Because it must have been a case of, right, why was that obvious and the other one wasn't? It must have been a case where it was all done in the time of the temple, and then we're just talking about eating the meat. Like we isolate, that's the only one issue we have. The meat was after the temple was destroyed, and it was obvious to him, of course, right, that you can't eat the meat. So there you have it. Bechor sets up a paradigm for all kachim kalim, and that's how you get it. And Rabbi Yirmiyah didn't like that because he has a contradiction between two brighton. The only way to resolve it is kachim no, kachim kalim yes. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.